welcome to All Things Youth Justice.
Hello, hello.
How are you today?
Good, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. Today we're joined by Jo Easton. Hi, Jo. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you. Would you please introduce yourself to us, please, and to the audience?
Yeah, I'm Jo Easton. I'm Director of Policy and Advocacy at a charity called Unlock that supports and advocates for people with criminal records.
It's great. And I'm Chikodi.
And I'm Jenny. Nice to meet you.
I don't know if you know anything about what we do, Jo.
A very little bit.
Okay. So I head up the Youth Justice team within Leicestershire Cares, and I work alongside Jenny on that. We work on two projects. This is the VIP project and the Phoenix program. And both projects work with young people in the criminal justice system to help them get into education, employment, or training. And one of the things that we have to go through in that process is disclosure, and the difficulties and the barriers that they can face whilst looking for jobs and sometimes get into education, how their criminal records can affect them. So when we met at the event at the Montfort University, I just thought that it would be you would be a good person to talk to and to just connect with. So please tell us about your organization, Unlock.
So we're a really small charity that, as I said, supports and advocates for people with criminal records. We have kind of two main sides of the organization. We have the advice side. We have an advice team that provides information on the website, but also takes calls, deals with WhatsApps, one-to-one meetings, any sort of advice around someone's criminal record, disclosure, helping with how to disclose as well as what to disclose. And they also sometimes help if people are wanting to challenge decisions or challenge poor behaviour. So they can help if people are trying to push back if something kind of has happened to them that they think's not right in terms of a recruitment decision or something. And then we have the advocacy side, which is the side that I work on. So that's kind of pushing for change, really, systemic change. And we do a couple of things there. One of the big ones is trying to influence Parliament, try and get legislative change through, and trying to get MPs and peers interested in the criminal record system and understanding it better. But we also do work directly with organisations, primarily employers and universities, and we try and help them improve their practice to be more inclusive. So that kind of starts with explaining what the issues are with disclosure in the criminal record system and why they might want to be more inclusive, and then helping them be more inclusive and make sure that they're not missing out on some really great people just because they're kind of not understanding the disclosure system at all.
Thank you so much for that. We have actually used Unlock with some of our participants, and the service you provide is amazing because sometimes it can be quite complex when a participant has various criminal convictions, and what to disclose, when to disclose, what is spent, what isn't spent. You made mention of sometimes supporting people to challenge decisions with recruiters. Do you often have a lot of that, and what's your success rate there?
So we don't have that much of it. I think it's a really tough ask. I think for anyone, especially if you're going for a job or trying to get into a university, if you get rejected, it's really tough to, kind of look at it and go, well, was that a fair process? And if it wasn't, I'm going to challenge it. It's human nature to think, I've been rejected, I just want to move on and try somewhere else. So but there are some people who have kind of the bandwidth and kind of and really no, this is really unfair. I really think this practice should change. And so our advice team can help with that. They can make sure everyone's got the right information, maybe give them a bit of support through the process. Unfortunately, challenging decisions can be a long process. It can be really tiring. And all of that time, you're not getting another job or not getting into university. So we appreciate it's a really big ask, which is why we kind of want systemic change as well. I should add that one of the most commonly used things on our website is the disclosure calculator, which gives people really good answers about whether it's spent or not. That's the most common question we get. Do I need to disclose it? Our advice team are brilliant, and sometimes things are a lot more complex. But for you know, most people, the disclosure calculator will give them a really good answer.
Okay.
So what's the process with the person that's had like a criminal conviction that wants to go into unlocked? Does he just call up an advisor? How does it work?
Yep, you can. There's a phone line that is kind of open during working hours. You can WhatsApp. You can kind of book in an online chat. You can send an email. Sometimes it's easier to do it via email because you can kind of think and make sure you get all the details down. But there's even, I think there's a forum. There's ways that you can contact via the website. So we try and kind of make it as easy as possible for people to reach us and get the answers that they need.
Okay, that's great. Can you please explain the current disclosure systems as it relates to both children and adults?
Yeah, so the current criminal record system is broadly very similar for both children and adults. So I'll just give you a kind of a bit of an overview. So basically, after you've completed a sentence, so you've got your sentence, there is then what is called a rehabilitation period. Now, for some sentences, some disposals like cautions, the rehabilitation period is actually straight away. So if you complete a caution, then it becomes spent immediately. The rehabilitation period is spent immediately. But depending on the length of the sentence or the offence type, you might have to disclose it for longer. So, for example, if you had a community order, once the community order is finished, there might be a rehabilitation period after that. And during that period, your conviction or caution is called, it's officially unspent. So it means in all situations, if an employer asks, do you have a conviction? Actually, what they're asking is, do you have an unspent conviction? That's what they should be asking, because that's the correct terminology. So if your rehabilitation period hasn't finished yet, it is officially unspent. And most convictions will become spent at some point. It might take quite a long time, but they will become spent. And then once something becomes spent, your rehabilitation period is finished, then you don't have to disclose it in most situations. So for things like getting insurance or going to university, or for most jobs, as I say, most jobs, they can only ask you about unspent convictions. There are certain jobs, there are certain regulated roles where they can ask about spent convictions. So they're generally things like becoming a teacher or a nurse or other professions like a solicitor that have particular regulations around them. And then it starts to get complicated. So once something's, so for those particular roles, they're allowed to ask about unspent convictions, but after an additional period, so additional to your rehabilitation period, things can become protected and filtered off those more elevated, more stringent checks. So it's very complicated. Something initially your conviction is unspent, and there'll be a time at which it becomes spent, but it's still showing up on the elevated checks for certain roles. And then after a period of time, a lot of things will then become protected and filtered off those elevated checks. There are some things that will never become spent. There are some things that might become spent but will never be filtered. So, for example, any custodial sentence, whether it doesn't have to be immediate, suspended sentences as well, they will always show up on those higher level checks for those regulated roles, like teaching, nursing, and things like that. So that's even if you got a suspended sentence of a couple of months or even a couple of weeks, it doesn't matter. They will always show up. So it's a complicated system. It doesn't just depend on what your offence was. It depends on how long the sentence was, and it depends who's asking and when they're asking and why they're asking. So it's really, really hard for people to know. What we tend to see is people want to be honest. They want to make sure if they need to disclose something, they are disclosing it. And people, employers, universities, people always say, oh, we're worried about not getting the right information. And we always say over disclosure is the bigger problem. People don't want to not tell you something that they legally have to. So people tend to over disclose and give information they don't actually have to do because they just because the system is so complex.
Mm.
And it's complex for everyone. As I just said, I talked about employers asking question, and we've all seen application forms where it says, do you have a criminal conviction?
Yeah.
And as I say, legally, they're allowed to ask about unspent criminal convictions,
Mm.
but often they don't. They just say criminal convictions, which immediately is confusing to people because they're like, oh, the Unlock website says I only need to disclose unspent, but they've asked for all. So do I have to disclose all? So it's complex for employers and organizations as well. Often they won't realize they're using really kind of confusing terminology. They just think we're just asking a simple question.
Yeah.
They don't realize actually it's not simple at all. It's really confusing. It's not very clear for people. And actually, you're probably getting a load of information that you shouldn't be getting.
Yeah.
And you might be using that to exclude people when you shouldn't be. So there's a lot of kind of risks due to the confusion and complexity, not just for the individuals, but for the organizations as well.
Yeah, so you hit the nail on the head right there at the end, because the complexity is not just for the individuals, it's for the organizations, because there's an expectation that even the organizations will be experts in this field, but they're not. So
Yeah.
to them, it's a simple question, but to the recipients, it's a very complex question, because then they have to sort of sift through and think, okay, do I need to disclose this? And if I do, what would be the impact? Because once that employer gets all of that information, immediately they have to make a decision based on what has been provided.
Yeah. And I think it's almost impossible as a human. If you get information and then someone comes along and says, oh, just ignore this bit. Don't use this bit for your decision when you're trying to decide to recruit people. I mean, we're human beings. It's impossible to unhear something once you've heard something.
Yeah.
And I think that links as well to, and I'm sure you see the same thing, the stigma and the misconceptions about someone having a criminal record and what it means. And we see still far too many employers are just saying, if you've got a criminal record, we're just excluding you, without understanding what it's for, when you got it, all of the things that you've done to turn your life around. And I think that stigma kind of like permeates through all of the decision making, which is really problematic.
And employers often fail to consider the contextual elements that led to that conviction in the first place. So they just look at whatever the sentence or the conviction is without looking at the whole person. What were you doing and feeling at that time? What was going around your life at that time? And it when we met with Dr. Nicola, she did from her research shared some of her findings with us and gave an example of a lady who's now in her 60s who's still being asked questions related to a conviction that she sustained when she was in her 20s at university. So I think there's so many misconceptions around the criminal justice system and what it means. And I think one of the first is, and the one that we hear a lot, is that people think that when they think of kind of, oh, someone's got a criminal record, they kind of go to almost kind of like the professional criminal, the kind of craze and what they've seen on TV shows of someone sitting there and calculating, I'm going to do this and I'm going to break this law and this is the punishment, but I don't mind. And actually anyone who's ever just go to your magistrate's court and just sit for a couple of hours and watch the people going through the court system, and you'll see people at the lowest point of their life, most chaotic point of their life, with so many kind of other problems that are all kind of almost kind of like just piling on top of them that have led to this situation. And here's so many people talk about prior trauma that they had, or that where did it all start? Well, I lost my job and then I lost my home and then I was drinking. And it's not this kind of idea of people making calculated decisions. It's people dealing with really horrific things and maybe making some poor decisions, or kind of life tossing them around a bit. And I think people just don't see that at all, which is a real problem, because once you've got that criminal record, it's just you're just kind of labeled, and as you say, it can be for life, which just ridiculous really when you think about it, that you're being held to account 30-40 years later
for
Okay.
the worst moment in your life when
Yeah.
you were really young. It's awful.
Yeah, that's why it's important to like speak to different employers to just change the narrative of how people think, because they don't consider that, like you mentioned, that people are human beings, and that can happen to someone like that's close to you as well. You just don't know. So yeah.
And the latest figures show that 12.5 million people in the UK have a criminal record.
Wow.
So you're exactly right when you say that. People with a criminal record are us.
Mm.
They're
The
you and
people.
me, they're our friends, they're our family. They're not this other group that you're never going to meet and never going to know.
That's right.
And I think when employers hear that, they kind of start thinking, oh, okay, well, hang on, this, this kind of them and us thing isn't going to work.
No.
Isn't going to work quite so well.
I do think there's a lot of work to be done around educating employers around like how personal a criminal record can be and how far-reaching it can be, so that they can make decisions.
It is one of the things. I mean, we always encourage employers to think really carefully that, before just using blanket exclusions, because they miss out on so many great candidates.
Right.
But even those employers who think, well, I've got a very good reason that I wouldn't want to employ someone with this offence type or something like that, we still encourage them to ask for disclosure statements, actually hear the person's story and take it into context with everything else you hear about the person. Because actually you might say, well, we don't want someone with this offence type. And then you find out actually it was incredibly minor, even if the offence type sounds scary. And as you say, it was 30 years ago. And you start thinking, actually, that's not really relevant, is it? So I think you're absolutely right. Really understanding the context and seeing the person first is really important, which is what good recruitment is, right? You want to know the person, and giving people an opportunity to talk about the positive things in their life rather than just labeling them with the kind of the worst or the kind of saddest bit of their life.
Thank you so much.
What are some of the issues that causes confusion between adult and youth justice?
I think the biggest problem for us is, as I said, the systems are broadly the same. So the rehabilitation periods are less, and things become filtered more quickly. So things aren't as disclosable for as long, but that is pretty much it. That is, other than that, the system for any convictions you got as a child are the same as when you're an adult. And the youth justice system is completely distinct. So the majority of youth cases are dealt with in magistrate courts. They're closed courts, not open to the public. If the press can attend, there's all sorts of reporting restrictions. The processes are different. It's much more informal and much more child-focused. The sentencing principles are different. They've got to focus on the welfare of the child rather than punishment. So you've got a youth justice system, which is all about taking account of the fact that children are different. They are children. They are not developed. They don't have mature decision making. They are still learning. They don't all have autonomy in a lot of things in their life. We don't let 12-year-olds vote, and yet we hold them culpable for their behaviour in a criminal court. But the criminal record system is pretty much the only bit of the youth justice system that kind of just is the same as the adult. Everything else is kind of looking at them going, oh, we need a child welfare response here. Children have got specific rights. We need to treat them differently than adults. But the criminal record system isn't really like that. And you can see people who are 15 when they got a conviction who are having to disclose it 40, 50 years later because they're still working at that age because they're so young. And the idea that when you're 15 that you should still be held to account for something like that when you grow up is completely counter to the whole way we should be dealing with children. So I think just fundamentally the system should be much more based on kind of welfare and the rights of the child, and giving children a chance to move on rather than saying did this at 15 and you're going to have to disclose it forever. It just seems utterly ridiculous to me.
Thank you so much for that, Jo. One thing that stood out for me when in that document that you sent through was the fact that some young people commit an offense whilst they're still under 18, but due to sometimes the caseload within the judicial system, there's a delay. There was we actually went to, I think, the Crown's Court sometime last year, and this young person had been waiting for about 2 years for his case to be heard. And what I thought was quite interesting was the offense may have been committed whilst they were a child, but then if they've had to wait till when they're past 18, they are now treated as an adult. Could you talk a bit more about that? And also, if you could also talk about drag through and the impact of of police records and disclosure as well, that'd be great.
Yeah, so the issue of turning 18 has always been a concern for people working with children and youth justice, and it's definitely got worse because there are lots of delays in the justice system now with the courts. We know there's a big backlog, and as you say, you can, if you're 17 at the time of you know, committing offence, but you don't get to go to court until you're an adult, you'll be treated as an adult. So all of those things I was talking about the youth justice system, about it being closed and confidential and everything like that, goes out the window, because if you're over 18, when your case comes to court, then you're treated as an adult. There is a lot of work done, mostly locally at local court level, to try and identify those young people who are going to turn 18 and to try and get them into court before that happens. Because if they can have their first appearance, then as a child, then they will be treated as a child for the rest of the system. So there's some great work being done with people trying to juggle caseloads and delays to try and make sure that people kind of, that the kids get into that first hearing. I mean, there's lots of reasons why you should be dealing with kids quickly anyway, because they change so quickly, and development, and that actually what might seem like just a couple of months to an adult for a child can feel like forever. So there's a lot of reasons why you should be trying to get them dealt with sooner anyway. Unfortunately, from a criminal record point of view, the criminal record is from the point of sentence. So it's when you get the sentence. So even if you get into the system, if you're an adult, when you get the sentence, you will get the adult system, which is unfortunate. As I say, at the moment, it doesn't make much difference because the systems are very similar, but it is a problem. But I think at the moment, all of the work to try and get kind of those turning 18 into court is done locally, and it would be great if there was maybe something a bit more systemic that didn't just rely on some local people identifying a problem and trying to do something to solve it. The other issues you asked about, so drag through basically means if you get a caution or conviction while you're and you have a previous offence that is still unspent, then that first offence doesn't become spent until the latter one does. So as it basically gets dragged through. So you're, again, this is another level of complication. You get a sentence and you get told what the rehabilitation period is, and you think it becomes spent then. But if you get another conviction during that time, basically nothing is spent until everything is spent, is basically the way of looking at it. If it's spent before you get another conviction, it stays spent. It doesn't kind of open it back up again. But it can mean that, you know, and you'll have seen this, especially when you're dealing with children and young people. When we're talking about those chaotic lives, trying to move on, it's a journey. It's not just you know, it's not like in a film that someone just wakes up and goes, oh, I'm just going to change my life and it's all going to be wonderful. It's a journey, and it's a really hard journey to go on. And so sometimes, you know, it might be a really successful journey, but that doesn't mean there aren't blips along the way. So sometimes kind of getting to the point of actually, you know, kind of completely, you know, stopping reoffending and managing to find somewhere to live and a job and a settled family to support you can take quite a long time. So there might be kind of more offences along the way. It's something I used to talk about a lot when I was working in a previous job, about what success looked like. And sometimes you can have, especially with children and young people, you can have kind of a grouping of offences, criminal activity that can even be just like associated with a weekend or a week or a really chaotic time. And actually success is actually, it can be reducing the frequency. It can be gradually kind of eking it out to get to the point where the behavior is completely turned around. But unfortunately, the drag through means that when you're disclosing, it can look really bad because you're disclosing something from years ago, which would normally be spent, but it's, you keep having to bring it through. And again, I think it can look quite scary to employers that actually when you talk it through and you explain, oh, well, this was, after this, I managed to get, a new foster home, and this was really important. And then that fell through and I kind of took a step back. And, when you talk about the story, you can kind of see the positive trajectory. But if you just look at the record, it can just look, well, you just didn't change, did you? You just kept kind of going back to the same thing. The issue of police information is an even more complex one. The system just gets more and more complex the more you dive into it. So when I was talking about those more stringent checks that can be done for those regulated roles, one of the highest level checks, so you have basic checks that anyone can do, any employer can do, which show all unspent convictions. And then you get standard and enhanced checks. And standard checks show anything that hasn't been filtered off. So those things that are spent but haven't been filtered off. So those are for kind of certain regulated roles, like becoming a solicitor and things like that, or maybe financial roles. And then for those kind of roles where the kind of the highest level of protection, so for teachers and things like that, you can do what's called an enhanced check. And as well as showing the kind of like the spent filtered convictions, it also includes police information. So this is information held on local police files. And it can really be anything, the police information. It doesn't need to be allegations or just interactions you've had with the police. There is some guidance set in place. So the police can't just share anything. It has to be relevant and it has to be proportionate and kind of linked to the role. But it's also, at the same time, that's quite a lot of discretion to leave. And it does mean that you might have things in your past that you think, I don't need to disclose this. No one's even going to know about it. I had a police interaction 20 years ago. But if the police decide that they think that's relevant to the role that you're applying for, they can actually disclose that. And like anything where you have kind of discretion, the system may work generally very well. But we also have heard from people contacting us some really awful examples of information that's been included on these checks, especially from when people were children. So interactions where, and there's lots of wonderful work being done to keep children out of court, to use alternatives, early intervention and divert them from the justice system, because that's what we know works. If you identify children early on and you manage to divert them and give them the support that they need, that's wonderful. But then if there are police records of interactions which haven't resulted in cautions or convictions, haven't gone to court at all, but the police can still disclose it, and even if the likelihood of the police disclosing it is quite small, it's still a possibility. And that's a really hard thing to kind of, it's always there at the back of your mind that you're kind of like, well, I don't think it's relevant, but what happens if the police think it's relevant? And then how do I argue it? And can I kind of persuade the police that it's not relevant? So I think that's a kind of, it's a bit of a black hole in the criminal record system that it's not really very transparent about how it works and the kind of cases and the kind of things that police will provide. And although the guidance is useful, I think from our point of view, it would be better if there was some more clarity around things that actually the police just can't include, so that it's not hanging over people, especially if as children they had that early intervention, but they had quite a lot of involvement with the police at a young age, but they managed to turn it around, didn't get any convictions, but the involvement, there's quite a lot of interactions there, because the idea that it might be disclosed 15, 20 years later is a really heavy burden to wear. And again, it comes back to that issue as well of disclosure. If you haven't told the employer about it and then it shows up and the police disclose it, is the employer going to think that you were trying to lie or you were trying to hide something? So I think it's a bit of a black hole, and I think it's a particular worry, I think, for children, where we've got great alternatives to custody and alternatives to court, but they do still involve police activity. Something that we one of the examples from last year, I think there's a lot of talk about this early intervention work, and one of the strategies that people talk about is police going into schools and kind of being there to kind of like identify problematic behavior in the school and kind of resolving it there and then by having a word with the child or having a word with the parents or whatever it is, which sounds great. But it's like, should the police be doing it? Because then that's police information. You know, and there's no point doing all of that and kind of like doing the early intervention work if it's gonna follow the child for the rest of their life anyway. There's a lot of discussions about what police should be doing rather than other people picking it up. But I think a lot of when they talk about, you know, well, police can do this and police can talk to the children and police can go and work with local community groups, you know, to help you know, kind of children avoid criminal behavior. Sounds great, as long as it then doesn't end up getting disclosed years later.
It doesn't record it, because what we have come across with some participants is various interactions with the police that eventually end up being NFA, so the police take no further action, and they may not necessarily have a conviction, but like you say, each police force and each police officer, when they receive that request, may process the request, what is relevant in a different way. So that the burden on the police officer to have to then think, is this relevant? Should I disclose it? They might decide to disclose it. And if an employer receives maybe the enhanced DVS itself comes out clear, but then it has like reams and reams of pages of interactions with the police officer, that person doesn't necessarily have a conviction, but they've had all of these interactions with the police, and they will, maybe unknown to them or unconsciously, they will take that information into account. They will have to, and they will have to think, okay, should we go with this person or somebody who's got a clean record and no interactions with the police? So,
yeah, I think you're so right. And I think that we see all the time, especially with employers, you know, they say, oh, well, the police provided this information. They're kind of like, so is that the police telling us we shouldn't employ them? No, it's not. And I'm like, but is it? Is it really? And I'm like, no, it's still not. But it's the police, right? It's like, well, if the police are giving me the information, maybe I should take that as a sign that the police are telling me I shouldn't be employing them. So I think that it's really hard as an individual then to kind of provide the true narrative, because you're kind of countering the police, the behemoth that is the police. The employers will look to for the people to give them the answers, which is a lot of onus on it, when actually it can just be different police officers having very different like ideas about this. And we, you know, also unfortunately know that there is a lot of bias in policing. We know there's a lot of disproportionality in policing, especially for children. And we see particularly young Black boys being, you know, treated differently all the time, and where there's lots of evidence all the way through the justice system, but it starts with the police and it continues through the justice system. And that's a really hard one to try and go in as an individual and say to an employer, well, yes, but actually there was a lot of racism or bias about why I was being spoken to, rather than my friends, you know, who were white. And again, it's putting the onus on the individual to try and provide an answer, which as a society, we haven't provided an answer. The disproportionality in youth justice is not going down. We're not solving it. So to put, you know, that onus on the individual to try and again argue their point and try and kind of like make up for the fact that there's bias and racism is just kind of an additional kind of like challenge that they have to face when they've already got enough challenges to face as it is.
You make such a key point there, Jo, because sometimes the onus of responsibility is on the individual. So I think when the system acknowledges that there is racism in the system, so if a young Black boy is being stopped amongst his white friends, 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 15 times, 20
Yeah.
times. And then there's eventually a response, a negative response, and the way he reacts to the police. He's then judged on that
Straight,
one
yeah.
interaction, and the judge or whoever doesn't take into account the fact that he's been stopped 15 times prior or 20 times prior and is expected to keep his cool as a child.
Yeah.
The way he interacts with the police. Yeah, it's just it's very wrong. But tell us about your upcoming roundtable. I do think that there is some work to be done, not just with employees, but also with the police, even with helping them with their understanding of how disclosure works and the long-term impacts that them making these flip decisions can have on an individual who's trying to get their lives back together. So maybe that's a conversation we can take up some other time, but there is some work to be done there as well.
Yeah, I would say that there is Working Chance, which is a great charity that helps women in particular in the justice system. They did some research and showed that actually employers are a lot more positive than they were 10, 15 years ago. So a lot fewer employers are rejecting people because of their criminal record. It's still like 30%, so it's still way too high. But I think, as you say, I think everyone collectively, I think just challenging those myths, and also explaining what the system's actually like. It's something that when we speak to employers and we go in and we're trying to convince them of change, and then when we talk about the disproportionality, and diversity and inclusion is a key priority for all employers. And then we talk about the disproportionality. And I always presume, because there's been so many reports on it, I presume that everyone knows about the disproportionality in the justice system. But it's not their sector. A lot of people don't. A lot of people haven't read the Lammy Review. I mean, why? I suppose if you didn't work in the sector, why would you? So I think it's up, I think if we just need to keep educating people about it, and that is having an impact. It just needs to have more of an impact. But the roundtable event is what we're hoping to do is there's been a lot of calls for a unique, distinct criminal record system for childhood offences. Actually, the Lammy Review was around this. So there's been a lot of support for having a different system. But kind of it's fallen at the last hurdle because there's never really been an agreement about what the new system should look like. So we're holding a roundtable and we're trying to get some experts together to try and kind of see if we can work out what a new system would broadly look like, so that we can say to the new government, look, these are kind of the experts in the field, and this is what they think would work as a system, to try and kind of get over that hurdle of having everyone having different ideas. So that's the plan, getting everyone together who kind of works with children or works kind of in the criminal record system, work out what we think the big challenges are, and what we think a system might look like that would kind of resolve those problems. And kind of broadly speaking, what I think would work is I think is having a much stricter system in terms of sealing records. So when you complete your sentence, and if it was a childhood sentence, that it becomes sealed kind of straight away for all but the most serious offences. And then after a period of time, it becomes automatically wiped. So it actually gets wiped. Not that it stays there until you're 100, which is what it is at the moment, but it's actually wiped. And I think there's also putting kind of some more stringent controls on police information and what can be shared. Can still be discretion if they still want to keep that, and there's court cases explaining why that's a good thing. But I think putting a few limits on that, especially around childhood offences, so that you're not worrying about police interaction showing up. And we appreciate that. I think for a lot of people, whenever we talk about anything like this, there's the kind of like, well, what about the really serious offences, the really scary offences? And what we would like to do is put in a system, because the vast majority of offences are not kind of on those really scary ones that people immediately think about taking someone's life or the really horrible sexual offences. So we would like to have something that I think is a more streamlined system for the majority of those offences, so that children can move on immediately and not have to disclose it when they're trying for their first job or trying to get into university. And then have a process for those the more serious offences, when you complete your sentence, that after a period of time you can proactively request. So you can kind of go to court and say, actually, I'd like my criminal records sealed, and you can then put forward the evidence about why it is. So we kind of think that that's a really balanced system, that kind of answers people's worries. And in particular, people are always really worried around safeguarding and people working in roles with children and vulnerable adults. I would say for safeguarding, I've kind of talked about the criminal record checks, but for the safeguarding role, so if you want to go and work with children or work with vulnerable adults, there's something called the barring process, which is in addition to the criminal record checks. So you need to basically not be on the barred list before you can work with children. And there's actually a bit of a distinct system. Yes, the criminal record can get you onto the barred list. Certain offence types you will be barred from working with children. But actually there's all sorts of things that get you on the barred list. If you're working with children and there's complaints against you and disciplinary, then you can maybe be barred from getting a job elsewhere. So you can't just move places. So usually when we talk about sealing criminal records or wiping them, people always go, but what about making sure that the really, really scary people, the unsafe people, aren't working with children? And we always say, well, there's another process for that. There is a barring process for those roles. So just like to kind of alleviate any concerns there. Not saying that the barring process is perfect and we might think it could work better, but when we're talking about the actual criminal record and having to disclose it in normal situations, we're not talking about safeguarding, and that is a different process, and it kind of cuts people off when that's kind of the argument they always use when we try and push for change. They take the most extreme cases and the most scary things that you might think of, and go, but we can't because of this. So we like to kind of cut off those arguments before they come, and they're not really relevant to this.
And I think that those are quite very good proposals as well, because people tend to want to judge like the general, like the 12 million or so people with the few, because those people who've actually committed high level offences, they're relatively few in comparison to the general amount of people who are walking about with convictions and who are being impacted by that. So I think there's a really useful convictions, because in addition to racial profiling within the justice system, those who are care experienced as well do happen to be heavily exposed to interactions with the police, because in some like homes they rely a bit too much on the police because they don't have sufficient controls over the young people, and those young people, they get used to interacting with the police, and some of their interactions are being recorded unknown to them whilst they're trying to get through the trauma of being in the care system in the first place. And then when they come out and start to want to get their lives together, it's such a huge challenge. So I do think
I think that's such an important point. And again, for people outside the system who don't understand it, it's explaining that for children who are in the care system, sometimes they can get, kind of police interactions, cautions for things that in the family home, you'd never think of calling the police for. It would just be right, you're going to bed with no supper, or I'm taking your Xbox off you for a week. But in a care home, it's a professional setting. They might have different policies around that. And I've looked at that before, and sometimes it's not even the start. It's built into their insurance policy that if a window gets broken, police have to be called.
Oh, wow.
So sometimes it's not even the individual workers in the care home. So I think there's so many reasons why people in the care system, as you say, already having so many challenges to deal with, can end up with police interactions or cautions on their record that you just wouldn't get if they were still in their family home. And I think there are so many other disproportionalities. We know that there's a lot of disproportionality around neurodiversity, again, especially with children, in terms of their behaviour and people not understanding their behaviour and responding to it in not a therapeutic way, but in kind of a punitive way. And so there's kind of connections of you know, which we never really talk about in the justice system because it's kind of this huge, big black hole. But the connections between poverty and the people kind of like going into the criminal justice system, again, kind of policing of certain areas and everything like that. It's kind of like that unsaid thing, isn't it? Is that we all know that there's actually kind of like quite a direct link there. The poorest areas get the most policing and therefore the most kind of like interaction with the criminal justice system that kind of escalates. And so there's so many disproportionalities about how the justice system works that I think that people don't really see from the outside. And then they don't realise that if you're excluding people with criminal records, you're excluding, as you say, people, you know, with experience of the care system, which, as I say, most employers, well, universities as well that we work with as well in particular, they've got access and participation plans about underrepresented groups and trying to target certain areas and certain groups to increase inclusion and increase diversity and fairness. And, you know, and actually they've only recently added in something around, I don't think it was a criminal record. I think it was people coming out of prison, but they're only just starting to recognise that that's a particular cohort that is underrepresented as well as having the kind of interactions and the intersectionality of all of these things in people's lives.
Yeah, I think it's so important for people to be like trauma informed as well, like get training in that, because I feel like there's such a lack of that as well. Yeah.
You're so right. I think especially with the police responses, their lack of training. I think you said before, Chikodi, about the police responding to something, about a certain behaviour and not really knowing right, and not knowing why they're getting a certain behaviour and just clamping down on it and saying, right, that's it, you know, we're arresting you and that, without actually understanding where it's coming from. That can actually be resolved completely, you know, peaceably. And you know, the justice system is creaking. The courts, huge delays. There's all of this discussion around the fact that prisons are full. And absolutely, we should be reducing the number of people that go to prison, but also reducing the number of people who kind of enter into the justice behaviour that they don't really need. Doesn't need a justice response, doesn't need a police response. As you said, it needs a therapeutic response, a kind of a caring response. That's one way of reducing the prison numbers, right? Stopping people at the beginning of the journey and kind of like diverting them off would be really helpful.
Thank you so much, Jo. It's been lovely speaking with you. Very insightful. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me on. It's great to talk about our work and to have the kind of experiences of people, you know, at the front end who are seeing all of these challenges on a daily basis.
Yeah, look forward to joining you at your roundtable.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.